The last embers of daylight cast long shadows across Ember Ridge as Malachi Boone worked the forge, his massive frame silhouetted against the orange glow of hot coals. The rhythmic clang of his hammer echoed through the quiet town, a sound as familiar to the locals as church bells on Sunday morning. What made the sound remarkable wasn't its strength or precision. It was that Boone accomplished it all with just one arm. The sleeve of his right arm was pinned neatly at the shoulder, yet Boone moved around his workshop with the balance and power of two men. His left arm, corded with muscle earned from years at the anvil, brought the hammer down with controlled fury, transforming raw metal into tools of beauty and purpose. The townspeople of Ember Ridge had grown accustomed to his silent strength, his unwavering resolve, and the mystery that surrounded him like morning mist. "Heard he was at Lookout Mountain," whispered Tom Gaines to a newcomer at the saloon. "Lost that arm, saving his whole regiment from a Confederate ambush." "I heard it was Chickamauga," countered the barkeeper, polishing a glass, "and that he killed 20 men before they finally shot him down." The truth? Nobody in Ember Ridge really knew. Malachi Boone had ridden into town 3 years ago, already one-armed and tight-lipped about his past. He'd built his forge at the edge of town with minimal help, hammering support beams into place himself despite curious onlookers wondering how a one-armed man could manage such a task. When asked about his missing limb, he'd simply say, "War took it," and return to his work. As darkness fell completely over the town, Boone doused his forge for the night. The hiss of steam rose like ghostly figures into the evening air. That's when they arrived. 5 riders, dust-covered and hard-eyed, moving slowly down Ember Ridge's main street. They weren't locals. Their horses were too lean, their faces unfamiliar. They paused outside each business, studying the buildings with calculating eyes. When they reached Boone's forge, they stopped. The leader, a man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, dismounted and sauntered toward the open doorway where Boone stood watching. "Fine place you got here, Smithy," the man called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Must be hard work, what with your condition." Boone said nothing, just stared back with eyes that had seen too much death to be intimidated by swagger. "We're collecting a tax," the scarred man continued, emboldened by Boone's silence. "Protection money. Times are dangerous for a one-armed man running a business all alone." Boone stepped forward, his massive frame filling the doorway. The only sound was the creak of the cooling metal in his forge. When he finally spoke, his voice was like gravel underfoot. "You're mistaking my arm for weakness," he said quietly. "That would be your first error." The scarred man's smirk faltered as he met Boone's gaze, eyes that promised violence as surely as storm clouds promised rain. "Think on it," the man said, backing toward his horse. "We'll be back tomorrow for an answer." As they rode away, Boone watched them go, his face unreadable. The townspeople who had witnessed the exchange retreated into their homes, whispering anxiously behind closed doors. They'd seen that look in Boone's eyes. Something was coming to Ember Ridge, something forged in blood and fire. If you thought this was tense, wait until you see what happens when the Rustlers push him too far. Have you ever encountered someone who was underestimated because of a disability? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The campfires of the 7th Ohio Cavalry burned low as young Lieutenant Malachi Boone sharpened his saber beneath a canopy of Tennessee stars. The year was 1863, and the war had already consumed 2 bitter years of his life. His hands, once soft from working his father's ledgers at their Cincinnati hardware store, were now calloused and stained with gunpowder residue. "Lieutenant," a private approached, offering him coffee. "The men are calling you something new." "Don't need a nickname," Boone replied, testing the edge of his blade against his thumb. "They're calling you the Hammer of Tennessee," the private continued anyway, "after what you did at Franklin." What he did at Franklin still haunted his dreams. 30 rebel soldiers had charged their position. Boone had broken his saber mid-fight and grabbed a fallen soldier's sledgehammer. When reinforcements arrived, they found him standing amid a circle of broken bodies, hammer raised, eyes vacant but stance unwavering. "Tell them to stop," Boone said quietly, but the name stuck like dried blood. In battle after battle, Boone led his men with a brutal efficiency that earned reluctant admiration from even hardened officers. He wasn't the most skilled horseman nor the best marksman, but when combat turned desperate, Boone fought with the terrifying resolve of a man who had already accepted his death. It was near Chattanooga where death finally claimed a piece of him, if not his life. His regiment, separated from the main force, found themselves surrounded by Confederate cavalry. Outmanned and outgunned, they made their stand in a small ravine. The battle lasted hours. "Fall back," Boone had ordered as enemy reinforcements arrived. "I'll hold them." For 20 bloody minutes he fought alone, sledgehammer in one hand, pistol in the other, standing over the body of their fallen color-bearer. A Confederate shell exploded nearby, shredding his right arm and peppering his body with shrapnel. Still, he fought on. By the time his men returned with reinforcements, Boone was slumped against a tree, right arm hanging in tatters, left hand still clutching the blood-slick handle of his hammer. 7 dead Confederate soldiers lay around him. "Leave me," he'd told the medic who found him. "I'm already dead." But death rejected Malachi Boone that day, just as he rejected the comfort others offered during his painful recovery. The surgeons took what remained of his arm, leaving him with an empty sleeve and phantom pains that woke him screaming in the night. When the war ended, he didn't return to Cincinnati. There was nothing there for the man he'd become. Instead, he wandered west, learning to forge metal one-handed from an old blacksmith in Missouri who took pity on him. "You can't swing a hammer with one arm," the blacksmith had said. "Watch me," Boone had replied. For months, he failed. Metal cooled before he could shape it. Simple tasks became day-long struggles. But Boone persisted, adapting his technique, building strength in his remaining arm, and fashioning tools that compensated for what he'd lost. By the time he rode into Ember Ridge years later, few would guess he hadn't been born a blacksmith. The war had taken his arm but given him something else, an unbreakable will forged in the fires of near death, hammered into shape by suffering and tempered by solitude. The hammer of Tennessee had become simply a smith, or so he'd hoped. Morning in Ember Ridge broke with a clarity that belied the tension hovering over the town. Malachi Boone was already at his forge before sunrise, the rhythmic clang of his hammer serving as the town's unofficial alarm clock. He worked with focused intensity, his mind not on the Rustlers' return, but on the iron he was shaping, a piece that would soon become more than just a tool. Hoofbeats on hard-packed dirt announced their arrival just past noon. This time there were 7 of them, dust-caked and swaggering, their confidence bolstered by numbers and the guns strapped visibly to their hips. The townspeople scattered inside as the men rode toward Boone's forge, some peering anxiously through windows while others huddled in back rooms. The scarred leader dismounted with theatrical slowness, spurs jangling as he approached the open doorway of the smithy. Boone didn't look up, continuing his work as the man leaned against the doorframe. "Well now, Smithy," the man called over the hammering. "Thought about our arrangement?" Boone dipped the glowing metal into a water barrel. Steam hissed violently, momentarily obscuring his face. When it cleared, his expression remained unchanged. "There is no arrangement," Boone said flatly, returning the metal to the coals. "This is extortion." The leader's face hardened. "We're offering protection. Times are dangerous. Rustlers about." A thin smile spread across his face. "Bandits, killers." "Only ones I see are wearing your faces," Boone replied, stoking the coals higher. One of the rustlers stepped forward, hand drifting toward his gun. "You best watch your mouth, cripple." Boone's hammer paused mid-stroke. The only sound was the crackling of the forge fire as he slowly set the tool down and straightened to his full height. 6'3" of hardened muscle and quiet rage towered over the rustlers. "That's your final answer?" the leader asked, voice tightening with anger. "It is." The leader spat on the ground near Boone's feet. We'll be collecting from the rest of town then. When they're paying double because you refused, they'll know who to blame." Boone said nothing, simply watched as the men remounted. The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. That night, while Boone slept in the small room behind his forge, they returned. Hoofbeats muffled by cloth wrapped around their horses' feet, the rustlers approached silently. By morning, the townspeople discovered what they'd left behind: a young calf, throat slit, dumped unceremoniously at Boone's doorstep. Blood had pooled and dried, staining the wooden step dark crimson. Mayor Whitlock led a small delegation to the forge after the discovery. "Mr. Boone," he began nervously, "perhaps we should consider meeting their demands, just temporarily until Sheriff Roberts returns from county business." Boone knelt by the dead animal, examining the clean cut across its throat. A butcher's precision, not a predator's savagery. "They'll never stop," Boone said quietly. "Give them money, they'll be back for more. Give them cattle, they'll demand horses next." "Please," Clara Hawthorne, the town's widowed rancher, implored. "We can't afford trouble. My ranch hands are just boys." Boone looked into their frightened faces and nodded once, seemingly in agreement. But after they left, he returned to his forge and pulled out a metal contraption he'd been working on for months, a prosthetic arm of his own design, with a socket where different tools could be attached. Today, he would fit it with a blade. Deputy Luke Fincher shifted uncomfortably as Boone laid the dead calf's ear on his desk. The young lawman's badge gleamed too brightly against his inexperienced chest, pinned there just 3 months earlier when the town council had decided Ember Ridge needed more than a part-time sheriff. "This is a warning," Boone said flatly. "Next time it'll be worse." Fincher swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the window as if expecting the rustlers to materialize. At 22, he was barely more than a boy playing at being a man, his gun belt sitting awkwardly on narrow hips. "I understand your concern, Mr. Boone, but Sheriff Roberts won't be back for at least another week. County business in Silverdale." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "So we do nothing?" Boone's tone was level, but disappointment hung heavy in each syllable. I'll make a report," Fincher stammered, reaching for a ledger that looked barely used. "Document the incident. When the sheriff returns, these men will have taken half the town's livestock and whatever else catches their eye." Boone leaned forward, his single arm resting on the desk. "You wear that badge for a reason, boy." Fincher's face flushed. "I'm not authorized to form a posse or pursue suspects without clear evidence. One dead calf doesn't—" "Men like that only stop when someone makes them," Boone interrupted. "That's the only law they understand." The deputy stood suddenly, indignation temporarily overwhelming his fear. "I won't have vigilante justice in Ember Ridge. The law works a certain way." "The law isn't here." Boone turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "And they know it." That night, a full moon illuminated Widow Hawthorne's ranch like daylight. Clara Hawthorne, who had run the spread alone since her husband died at Antietam, sat on her porch with a shotgun across her lap. Her 2 young ranch hands, brothers barely 16, kept watch from the barn. It wasn't enough. The rustlers came with practiced efficiency, cutting fences at the south pasture where the prize longhorns grazed. 4 cows, worth more than most townspeople earned in months, were herded silently away into the darkness. From his forge on the hill overlooking town, Boone watched the distant movement of shapes against the moonlit grass. His eyes, trained by war to spot enemy movements at night, narrowed as he tracked their progress. The iron prosthetic was strapped to his shoulder now, a curved blade attached where his hand should have been. Inside his small living quarters, a cavalry saber hung on the wall, untouched for years. Below it rested a Union blue keepy hat, faded and still bearing dark stains that never quite washed out. Boone's gaze returned to the rustlers' retreating forms. His decision was made. Darkness still shrouded Ember Ridge when Malachi Boone saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had carried him west after the war. The animal stood patiently as Boone tightened the cinch one-handed, a skill perfected through necessity. He worked methodically, his movements economical and practiced. Into his saddlebags went tools of his trade, horseshoes that could double as throwing weapons, a small hammer for close work, lengths of thin wire. Strapped to his thigh was an army Colt, loaded but untouched for years. The cavalry saber hung at his hip, its familiar weight both comforting and troubling. Boone rode out as the first hints of gray touched the eastern horizon. The prosthetic arm gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light, its blade attachment replaced with a hook better suited for tracking. His horse moved silently across the grassland, Boone instinctively keeping to lower ground and shadow. Cavalry scout habits that had never left him. 2 miles outside town, he dismounted to study the ground. The rustlers had been careless, confident no one would follow. Boone's fingers traced hoofprints in the dirt, counting. 6 horses, 4 cows. 1 horse limped slightly, the left foreleg leaving a distinctive drag in the soil. "Found you," he murmured. He tracked them with the patience of a mountain lion. When the sun rose fully, he spotted horseback tracks veering unexpectedly east toward a dried arroyo. Clever. The hard stone bed would hide their trail. But Boone had hunted men far more dangerous than these during the war. He found broken cholla branches where they'd entered the wash, a piece of cloth snagged on a cactus spine, a damp patch where a horse had relieved itself minutes before. Each sign confirmed he was closing in. Rounding a bend in the arroyo, Boone reined in sharply. A half-mile ahead, smoke rose thinly against the morning sky. He dismounted, secured his horse, and continued on foot, keeping to the arroyo's shadow. The rustlers' camp was nestled in a natural depression where the arroyo widened. 6 men, just as he'd counted from the tracks. The stolen longhorns were penned in a hasty corral of rope and stakes. 2 men slept while others ate breakfast around a small fire. The scarred leader sat apart, cleaning a rifle with methodical precision. Boone watched silently, assessing each man. 2 wore pistols low on their hips, gunfighters. Another kept a shotgun close at hand. All looked trail-hardened, dangerous. Not simple cattle thieves, but men accustomed to violence. For a moment, memory superimposed itself over reality. He was behind Confederate lines again, counting enemy positions, planning an attack against impossible odds. The weight of responsibility for his men's lives pressed down on him. But there were no men to lead now, no regiment at his back, just 1 arm, 1 saber, and the element of surprise. As the sun crested the arroyo wall, Boone made his decision. He backtracked to his horse and removed his prosthetic, replacing the hook with the hammer attachment he'd forged himself. Then he strapped it securely into place. The Hammer of Tennessee was riding into battle one last time. The rustlers didn't notice Boone until he was halfway across the clearing. He approached with deliberate steps, unhurried, the morning sun at his back casting his shadow long before him. The hammer attachment on his prosthetic arm gleamed dully, swinging slightly with each stride. The first man to spot him choked on his coffee, sputtering a warning that brought the others to their feet. Guns were drawn, but not aimed, confusion rather than fear governing their reactions. Who would be foolish enough to walk alone into their camp? "Morning, gentlemen," Boone called out, his voice carrying across the arroyo with an authority that stopped them cold. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." The scarred leader stepped forward, recognition dawning on his face. "Well, if it ain't the crippled blacksmith," he laughed, gesturing toward the penned longhorns. "Come to rescue some cows with 1 arm? You've got sand, I'll give you that." The others joined in the laughter, tension dissolving into mockery as they circled around Boone. 1 man, tall and gaunt with tobacco-stained teeth, spat near Boone's boots. "Half a man thinks he's gonna take us all on," the gaunt man sneered. "Why don't you hop back to your forge before you get really hurt?" Boone's eyes never left the leaders. "Return the cattle, leave this territory. That's the only warning you get." The leader's smile faltered slightly at Boone's calm. There was something in the blacksmith's stance, a coiled readiness that spoke of experience. But pride outweighed caution. "Boys," he drawled, "show our guest what happens to heroes in these parts." The gaunt man moved first, lunging toward Boone with a bowie knife. In one fluid motion, Boone reached into his coat and flung a horseshoe with deadly accuracy. It struck the man's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife fell to the dirt as he howled in pain. What followed was chaos. Two men rushed Boone simultaneously. He sidestepped the first, using his momentum to send him sprawling, then pivoted to meet the second with his prosthetic hammer. The impact crumpled the man like paper. A shot rang out, the bullet whistling past Boone's ear. He dove toward the campfire, scooping up a shovel still hot from the embers. With a practiced flick, he sent burning coals into the shooter's face. The man screamed, dropping his gun to claw at his eyes. The leader, seeing his men falling, drew his pistol. Boone was quicker. His cavalry saber cleared its scabbard with a metallic hiss, the blade catching sunlight as it slashed down, severing the gun belt from the leader's waist. "What the hell are you?" the leader gasped, stumbling backward. "Just a blacksmith," Boone replied, advancing steadily. The remaining rustler tried to flee. Boone's hammer caught him behind the knee, dropping him instantly. Within minutes, it was over. Boone stood among the groaning, unconscious bodies, his breath coming in controlled, measured intervals. Blood trickled from a cut on his cheek, the only mark they'd managed to leave on him. With methodical efficiency, he gathered their weapons, then used their own lariats to bind the men who were still conscious. "The widow's cattle," he told the terrified leader, "are coming home with me." The sun was high overhead when Ember Ridge's residents spotted the dust cloud approaching from the east. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Doors swung open as people emerged, shading their eyes against the glare. Deputy Fincher stood on the jailhouse steps, one hand nervously resting on his holster. Malachi Boone rode at a steady pace, his posture straight as a cavalry officer's. Behind him, attached to a lead rope, came the 4 stolen longhorns, their massive horns swaying with each plodding step. But it was what followed the cattle that drew gasps from the gathering crowd. 3 rustlers, bound and bloodied, stumbled along behind the cows, their hands tied to a single long rope. 2 more were draped unconscious across their own horses, secured with ingenious knots that Boone had managed one-handed. The scarred leader walked directly behind Boone's mount, a separate rope around his neck like a leash, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. Boone didn't acknowledge the staring townspeople as he guided the procession down the main street. His expression remained impassive, eyes forward as if delivering rustlers was as ordinary as delivering horseshoes. "Dear Lord," Mayor Whitlock murmured as the parade reached the town square. "What happened to them?" "Justice," Boone replied simply, dismounting with practiced ease. Deputy Fincher pushed through the crowd, his young face flushed with a mixture of awe and official indignation. "Mr. Boone, this is highly irregular. You can't just—" "Can't just what?" Boone interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly silent square. "Can't protect what's ours? Can't enforce the law when those paid to do it won't?" Fincher's mouth opened and closed without sound, the rebuke landing like a physical blow. Shame colored his cheeks as he looked at the captured rustlers, then back at the expectant faces of the townspeople. I'll take custody of the prisoners," he finally managed. Boone untied the lead rope and handed it to the deputy. "There were 6, he said. "The others not coming back." A murmur ran through the crowd. Boone turned to address them, his voice carrying without shouting, a commander's voice that needed no amplification. "You let fear run things," he said, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "Fear makes you weak, makes you targets. These men," he gestured toward the rustlers, "they feed on that fear. Grow fat on it while you grow hungry." He stepped closer to the bound leader, who flinched involuntarily. "I didn't run them out for thanks. Did it because someone had to." With that, Boone turned to leave, but found his path blocked by Widow Hawthorne. She stood straight back despite her 60 years, dignity evident in every line of her weathered face. "Mr. Boone," she said firmly, "my ranch hands will take the cattle home. But you—" She paused, her voice softening slightly. "You will join me for dinner tonight. I don't take no for an answer." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps amusement, crossed Boone's face before he nodded once in acceptance. As he walked back toward his forge, the townspeople parted before him, their whispers following in his wake. The legend of Malachi Boone was being forged anew, hammered into shape by his actions rather than mere rumors. For 3 peaceful days, Ember Ridge breathed easier. Deputy Fincher, emboldened by the town's approval, guarded his prisoners with newfound diligence. The captured rustlers awaited transport to the county seat, their injuries tended to, but their comfort given little consideration. Malachi Boone returned to his regular routine, the rhythmic sound of his hammer a reassuring constant. Few mentioned his exploits directly to him, but children watched him with wide-eyed fascination, and more than one town elder nodded respectfully when he passed. The dinner at Widow Hawthorne's had been a quiet affair, 2 people who preferred silence sharing a meal and perhaps understanding each other better for the words left unspoken. On the 4th night, as darkness settled over the town, a rider approached from the north, hard galloping, desperate. It was Tanner Quinn, a rancher from 10 miles out. "Fire!" he shouted, reining in the town square. "Rustlers burning homesteads along Creek Road!" The townsfolk gathered quickly, fear etched on their faces. 15 riders at least, Quinn reported, torching barns and threatening families. They were working their way toward Ember Ridge. "They're coming for their men," Boone said, materializing beside Quinn's horse. "And for revenge." Deputy Fincher organized a hasty defense, positioning armed men at the town's approaches. Boone watched with guarded approval, but slipped away to his forge while the others prepared. What none of them realized was that the fires were a distraction. As midnight approached, shadows detached themselves from the darkness behind Boone's smithy, 4 men moving with murderous intent. They expected to find Boone sleeping. Instead, they found his forge cold and the building empty. "Check the back," one whispered, gesturing toward the small living quarters. The first man to round the corner triggered a tripwire. A counterweight dropped, swinging a hammer on a pendulum directly into his chest. He flew backward with a sickening crack of ribs. Another rushed forward only to step onto caltrops, twisted metal spikes Boone had scattered in the darkness. His scream alerted the others, but it was too late. Boone emerged from the shadows of his own roof, dropping onto the third man like judgment from above. His prosthetic, now fitted with a spiked maul head, caught the moonlight as it descended. The last rustler raised his gun, but something flashed through the air. A red-hot horseshoe flung with deadly accuracy. It caught him across the temple, the searing metal enforced together, dropping him instantly. In the town square, the defenders heard the commotion and turned toward the forge. What they saw was Boone standing amid 4 fallen bodies, his silhouette backlit by the rising moon, prosthetic hammer raised like an avenging spirit. The main attack came with the first light of dawn. 20 riders thundered into Ember Ridge from 2 directions, guns blazing more for intimidation than accuracy. Town defenders scattered for cover, returning fire from windows and behind water troughs. At their center rode Jeb Cutler, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him across 3 territories. His face was a roadmap of old scars and fresh hatred, his gray-streaked beard failing to hide the distinctive puckered wound that marked his jaw. "Boone!" he roared, reining in the center of town. "Face me, you one-armed bastard!" The gunfire slowed, then stopped altogether. An eerie silence falling over Ember Ridge. Defenders and attackers alike held their breath as Malachi Boone stepped into the street, 50 yards from Cutler. Recognition flashed in Boone's eyes. "Jeb Cutler," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "Last saw you at Missionary Ridge." Cutler's face twisted with savage pleasure. "The great hammer of Tennessee remembers me. I'm touched." He spat on the ground. "I was with the 4th Georgia that day. Watch you cut down 8 of my friends before we took your arm." "You took the arm," Boone replied evenly. "Never take the man." Cutler dismounted, his spurs jingling ominously in the morning quiet. "Should have finished you when I had the chance. Won't make that mistake twice." The rustlers spread out, forming a loose circle around the two men. Deputy Fincher and the town defenders watched helplessly, outmanned and outgunned. "Your quarrels with me," Boone said. "Let these people be." Cutler laughed harshly. "My quarrels with anyone foolish enough to stand against me. But you—" His hand drifted to his gun belt. "You, I'll enjoy it personally." What happened next became the stuff of Ember Ridge legend. Cutler drew first, his revolver clearing leather with practiced speed. But Boone was already moving, not away but toward the danger. The bullet grazed his shoulder as he closed the distance. Before Cutler could fire again, Boone's prosthetic hammer swung in a vicious arc. Cutler blocked with his forearm, bones snapping audibly under the impact. He howled but managed to slam his pistol butt against Boone's temple. Both men staggered, blood running into Boone's eyes as Cutler cradled his shattered arm. They circled each other, neither giving ground. "You fight dirty for a Union man," Cutler gasped. "War's over," Boone replied. "This is just survival." Cutler lunged with a hidden knife. Boone caught his wrist, twisted, and drove his forehead into Cutler's nose. As the man stumbled backward, Boone's hammer came around in a final devastating blow. Cutler collapsed in the dirt, unconscious before he hit the ground. The rustlers, seeing their leader fallen, hesitated only briefly before spurring their horses in retreat. Ember Ridge had won. The weeks that followed the battle became a time of rebuilding and reflection for Ember Ridge. Windows shattered by stray bullets were replaced. Bullet holes in the church steeple were patched. The bodies of rustlers who couldn't flee were buried in unmarked graves at the edge of town. Jeb Cutler and his surviving men were transported to territorial prison under heavy guard. Sheriff Roberts, upon his return, could scarcely believe the tale told by Deputy Fincher, who now wore his badge with quiet pride rather than nervous uncertainty. Malachi Boone healed quickly, the gash on his temple leaving yet another scar among the many that mapped his history across his body. He refused any special treatment, returning to his forge the day after the fight, his hammer singing against the anvil as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the town had changed. Where once they had wondered about Boone's past in whispers, now they spoke of his present with reverence. Farmers and ranchers took to leaving gifts at his door: fresh eggs, home-baked bread, a bottle of fine whiskey. Children who had once been warned to keep their distance now played war games where the bravest among them was always the hammer. On a warm Saturday, a month after the rustlers' defeat, Mayor Whitlock organized a town gathering. Tables laden with food filled the square, and banners hung from balconies. Boone had declined to attend, but Widow Hawthorne appeared at his forge just as the celebration began. "They're doing this for you," she said simply. "The least you can do is show your face." When Boone entered the square, conversation hushed momentarily before erupting into applause. He stood uncomfortably as Mayor Whitlock made a flowery speech about courage and salvation, his eyes scanning the perimeter, old habits never truly fading. It was young Tommy Jenkins, the blacksmith's apprentice, who approached Boone afterward, eyes shining with admiration. "Mr. Boone," he said, voice cracking with adolescence, "my pa says we should call you the Hammer of Ember Ridge now." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Boone looked at their faces, men who had fought beside him, women who had tended the wounded, children who would grow up knowing that one person could make a difference. "The war gave me that name," he said quietly. "I didn't care much for it then." Tommy's face fell, but Boone continued, something close to a smile touching his weather-worn face. "But Ember Ridge, this is home now. I reckon I can live with it." As the celebration continued around him, Boone slipped away, back to the solitude of his forge. The fire burned hot and bright as he worked, not on weapons this time, but on a bell for the newly repaired church steeple. With each strike of his hammer, the metal took shape, imperfect perhaps, bearing the marks of its making, but stronger for having endured the fire. Not unlike the town, not unlike the man. As dusk fell, the sound of his hammer echoed through Ember Ridge. steady and sure, a promise of protection, a reminder of resilience. The legend of Malachi Boone, the Hammer of Ember Ridge, was complete, forged in the fires of war, tempered by loss, and polished to a lasting shine by the very community he had saved. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.